During the Cold War, the disappearance of an object was never treated as an accident, especially if that object was classified, strategic, and carefully guarded. When the Soviet Union lost control over a critical asset in the early 1980s, the first assumption inside the KGB was not failure, but interference. The asset was not publicly acknowledged. It did not exist on maps, in official budgets, or in open military doctrine. Only a limited number of departments knew its true purpose. Its value was not symbolic. It was practical, measurable, and deeply integrated into Soviet planning. When routine checks revealed that the asset had gone silent, the response was immediate but contained. No alarms were raised publicly. No emergency protocols were triggered. Inside the KGB, however, the tone shifted sharply. Silence in such systems rarely meant technical malfunction. It usually meant compromise. Initial assessments ruled out internal error. Maintenance logs were intact. Personnel assignments showed no anomalies. Communication schedules had been followed precisely until the final transmission. Whatever had happened, it had not been random. That narrowed the list of possibilities. From the beginning, suspicion pointed outward. The United States had both the capability and the motive. American intelligence had invested heavily in detecting and neutralizing Soviet strategic infrastructure. The loss of this asset aligned too closely with U.S. intelligence priorities to be ignored. The KGB began reconstructing the final days of operation minute by minute. Analysts examined telemetry, signal behavior, and response latency. What emerged was unsettling. The asset had not failed abruptly. It had been isolated. Its signals weakened gradually, as if interference had been introduced carefully rather than forcefully. This pattern suggested intent. Inside KGB counterintelligence, a working theory formed. The asset had been discovered, monitored, and neutralized, not destroyed but rendered unusable. Such an approach minimized political risk while maximizing strategic advantage. It was consistent with American doctrine. Still, no direct evidence existed. The challenge was attribution. Accusing the United States without proof risked escalation. Remaining silent risked repeating the vulnerability elsewhere. The KGB needed certainty before action. But certainty was precisely what was missing. To gain clarity, the KGB expanded its analysis beyond the asset itself. American intelligence activity was reviewed across multiple theaters: satellite movements, naval patterns, signals intelligence behavior. Several indicators suggested heightened U.S. attention in regions connected indirectly to the lost object. Individually, these indicators meant little. Together, they formed a picture that was difficult to dismiss. What troubled Soviet analysts most was timing. The loss occurred during a period of increased global tension, when misinterpretation could trigger rapid response. If the United States had deliberately targeted the asset, it was sending a message. But what message? Some argued it was a test. Others believed it was a warning. A smaller group feared it was preparation for something larger. The KGB leadership understood the danger of assumptions. Blaming the United States without proof could lock both sides into a narrative that neither could easily escape. Yet ignoring the possibility of American involvement was equally dangerous. The asset remained silent. No recovery was possible. No backup system could replace its function quickly. Whatever knowledge it represented was now inaccessible. The Soviet Union had lost something critical. And inside the KGB, the question was no longer whether the United States was responsible. It was whether the loss itself was meant to provoke a reaction. That uncertainty marked the beginning of a much deeper investigation, one that would challenge not only Soviet defenses, but Soviet confidence. With the asset confirmed lost, the KGB shifted from technical reconstruction to counterintelligence analysis. The failure itself was no longer the primary concern. The priority became understanding how the loss had occurred, without triggering alarms, and why no warning signs had been detected in advance. Inside the KGB, analysts revisited a principle that guided all strategic investigations. Complex systems rarely failed silently. If the asset had been neutralized without visible disruption, it suggested long-term observation rather than sudden action. That implied penetration, not necessarily physical, but informational. Attention turned inward. Personnel connected to the asset were reviewed again, this time not for negligence but for patterns. Travel histories, professional trajectories, subtle deviations in routine. No direct evidence of betrayal emerged, but something else did. Several individuals had been reassigned quietly in the months leading up to the loss. None of the reassignments were suspicious on their own. Together, they weakened oversight. This raised a disturbing possibility. The vulnerability may not have been created intentionally, but it may have been noticed and exploited from the outside. The KGB expanded its inquiry beyond human factors. Communications surrounding the asset were analyzed for anomalies that had previously been dismissed as noise. Slight timing shifts, minor signal distortions, delays too small to trigger alerts. In hindsight, these irregularities formed a pattern of interference rather than failure. Such precision required capability. The United States possessed it. American intelligence had invested heavily in non-destructive methods of neutralization. Disruption without attribution reduced escalation. Risk while delivering strategic advantage. The loss of the Soviet asset fit this model perfectly. It removed functionality without creating a visible incident. Still, suspicion was not proof. The KGB needed to determine whether the loss was the result of an American operation or a coincidence amplified by expectation. To do this, Soviet counterintelligence examined U.S. behavior after the event. If the United States had succeeded, its intelligence posture would change. It did. American analytical activity shifted subtly. Focus moved away from areas previously associated with the asset. Certain monitoring efforts were reduced, others intensified elsewhere. This redistribution suggested confidence. The United States appeared to believe that a problem had been resolved. That belief was more telling than any intercepted message. Internally, the KGB debated its next move. Public accusation was rejected immediately. Without evidence, it would appear defensive. Retaliation without clarity risked escalation. Doing nothing, however, risked signaling weakness. The solution was indirect verification. Soviet intelligence introduced controlled changes in related systems. Minor adjustments, limited exposure, nothing overt. The objective was to observe whether American intelligence reacted as if it understood the system or as if it was still searching. The reaction was swift and precise. American responses aligned too closely with the adjustments to be coincidence. This confirmed that the United States had not only detected the asset, but had mapped its role within a larger structure. The loss was not accidental. It was deliberate. Inside the KGB, the conclusion hardened. The Soviet Union had not simply lost an object. It had lost an advantage. Yet the most troubling question remained unanswered. Why had the United States chosen this moment? Why remove the asset quietly instead of exploiting it openly? And what did Washington expect the Soviet response to be? Some argued the operation was defensive. Others believed it was preparatory. A third theory gained traction slowly and reluctantly. The loss was meant to test Soviet reaction speed and judgment. If that was true, then reacting emotionally would complete the test. The KGB understood that restraint was now a strategic necessity. Blame could wait. Understanding could not. The investigation widened, and with it, the realization grew that the loss of the asset was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation, one that would not be fought openly, but through interpretation, patience, and control. As the investigation expanded, the KGB began to confront an uncomfortable realization. The loss of the asset was not an isolated incident. It fit into a broader pattern that had gone unnoticed precisely because each element appeared insignificant on its own. For years, Soviet counterintelligence had assumed that its most sensitive systems were either secure or under constant threat. There was little room for gradual erosion in this logic. Yet the evidence suggested something different. The asset had not been attacked aggressively. It had been studied, mapped, and quietly sidelined. This implied patience. The KGB reconstructed the timeline further back, well before the asset went silent. Analysts examined changes in American intelligence behavior over multiple years. Certain reconnaissance priorities had shifted subtly. Funding patterns inside. U.S. intelligence hinted at long-term projects rather than reactive operations. None of this proved intent, but it suggested preparation. Attention returned to Soviet assumptions. The KGB had relied on redundancy and secrecy. Multiple layers of protection were believed to compensate for any single vulnerability. But redundancy only worked if threats were detected early. In this case, detection had failed not because systems were blind, but because the threat had behaved like noise. The United States, if responsible, had not tried to break the system. It had blended into it. This forced a reassessment of doctrine. Soviet counterintelligence had focused heavily on identifying dramatic intrusion, defectors, sabotage, espionage. The loss of the asset suggested a different approach. Influence without presence, disruption without destruction. Inside the KGB, this raised concerns beyond the single incident. If one asset could be neutralized so quietly, others might already be compromised without detection. Confidence became dangerous. Yet escalation was still not an option. The political climate was fragile. Any accusation against the United States would require proof strong enough to withstand international scrutiny. None existed. The KGB understood that reacting prematurely could validate American success. Silence preserved uncertainty. Instead, the KGB shifted focus toward internal resilience. Related systems were hardened. Access was narrowed. Analytical oversight increased. These measures were implemented quietly, without reference to the lost asset. The goal was to adapt without signaling vulnerability. At the same time, Soviet intelligence monitored American reactions carefully. If the United States believed its operation had succeeded, complacency might follow. That complacency could reveal methods. What emerged was a paradox. American behavior suggested confidence, but not triumph. There was no overt exploitation of the advantage, no public signaling. This restraint suggested caution or uncertainty. Some analysts proposed a new interpretation. The United States may not have fully understood what it had neutralized. The operation may have been exploratory rather than decisive. If true, the loss of the asset was not the end of an American plan, but a midpoint. This possibility changed everything. If the United States was still testing Soviet systems, then the loss of the asset was a probe. The Soviet response, or lack of one, would shape future actions. The KGB realized it was now participating in an unspoken dialogue. Every adjustment, every silence, every routine action carried interpretive weight. The KGB chose consistency, no dramatic shifts, no visible panic. The disappearance of the asset was treated as a technical anomaly publicly, even as internal measures intensified. This response denied the United States clear feedback. Over time, American intelligence activity appeared to slow. Certain exploratory behaviors ceased. This suggested that the absence of Soviet reaction had complicated U.S. interpretation. The test, if it was one, had not produced clear results. For the KGB, this was a partial relief, but it did not restore what had been lost. The asset remained unrecoverable. Its value was gone permanently. What remained was a lesson, one learned too late. Secrecy alone was not protection. Predictability was not safety. And silence, while useful, could not undo damage already done. The KGB now faced a final decision, whether to treat the loss as an isolated failure to be buried quietly, or as evidence of a deeper vulnerability that required a fundamental shift in how threats were understood. The answer would define how the Soviet Union responded to the next signal. And there would be a next signal. By the time the KGB accepted that the asset was permanently lost, the investigation had shifted from blame to consequence. The question was no longer who had done it, but what the loss revealed about the balance of intelligence power. The Soviet system had not collapsed, but it had been touched without noticing. That realization was more dangerous than sabotage. Internally, the KGB classified the incident as a strategic breach without penetration. No agents had been arrested. No communications had been intercepted decisively. No internal traitors had been identified. And yet, the result was undeniable. A critical capability had been removed from the Soviet equation. This forced a painful reassessment of assumptions that had guided Soviet counterintelligence for decades. Protection had been built around secrecy and control. But the incident demonstrated that secrecy could be observed from the outside, mapped slowly and neutralized without ever being entered. The United States, if responsible, had not needed access. It had needed understanding. That distinction reshaped internal doctrine. Analysts warned that future threats would not announce themselves as attacks. They would appear as technical anomalies, environmental interference, or routine degradation. The enemy would not strike. It would wait. At the same time, political leadership demanded restraint. Accusing the United States without proof could escalate tensions at a moment when stability was fragile. The loss of the asset had occurred quietly. Responding loudly would hand initiative to the other side. So the KGB chose containment. Related systems were quietly restructured. Redundancies were redesigned not for backup, but for deception. Analytical oversight increased. Patterns were deliberately varied to deny long-term observation. These changes were implemented slowly to avoid signaling urgency. The goal was not recovery, it was denial. American intelligence behavior continued to be monitored. There were no signs of aggressive exploitation. No sudden shifts that suggested full understanding. This reinforced a critical suspicion. The United States may not have realized the full significance of what it had neutralized. If true, then reacting strongly would clarify the success of the operation. Silence preserved ambiguity. This created an uncomfortable equilibrium. Both sides knew something had happened. Neither side knew exactly how much the other knew. The loss of the asset became a shared uncertainty rather than a resolved event. Within the KGB, the incident was used as a case study. New officers were taught that intelligence failures were not always dramatic. Sometimes they arrived quietly, disguised as routine degradation. The absence of alarms did not mean safety. As months passed, the global situation shifted. Other crises demanded attention. The lost asset faded from daily focus, but it never disappeared from institutional memory. It remained a reminder that the intelligence contest had evolved. The Cold War was no longer only about who had more weapons or better agents. It was about who could understand systems deeply enough to neutralize them without confrontation. For the KGB, this realization was sobering. It suggested that future losses might occur without warning and without attribution. Blame would always lag behind consequence. The final debate centered on one question. Had the Soviet Union lost an object, or had it lost an illusion? The illusion was that critical systems were either secure or under attack. The truth was more unsettling. They could be quietly rendered irrelevant. That understanding prepared the KGB for what came next. Because the loss of the asset was not the end of the story. It was a signal. And signals once sent are rarely sent only once. The loss of the asset was never acknowledged publicly. No announcement was made. No responsibility was assigned. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, the incident reshaped how the KGB viewed the intelligence contest with the United States. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Soviet Union had not lost the asset because of a mistake, betrayal, or technical failure. It had lost it because the nature of confrontation had changed. The threat no longer needed to break in. It only needed to observe long enough to understand. For the KGB, this realization marked the end of an era. Traditional counterintelligence models assumed that danger arrived loudly through defection, sabotage, or exposure. The incident proved that the most effective operations could be silent, patient, and invisible. The United States, if responsible, had not sought escalation. There was no public victory, no demonstration of superiority. The operation's success depended on ambiguity. As long as the Soviet Union could not prove intent, it could not respond without risk. That ambiguity became the final outcome. Internally, the KGB documented the case as a strategic loss without confrontation. It was studied quietly, stripped of emotion, and used to revise internal doctrine. Future threats would be assumed to exist even in the absence of evidence. Stability would no longer be equated with safety. What remained unresolved was motive. Why had the United States chosen to neutralize the asset rather than exploit it openly? Why remove capability instead of turning it into leverage? The most convincing answer was also the simplest. Open exploitation invited response. Quiet removal did not. By doing nothing visible, the United States denied the Soviet Union a clear narrative. There was no incident to protest, no operation to condemn, only absence, and absence could not be punished. As years passed, the Cold War shifted toward its conclusion. Political structures weakened. Strategic priorities changed. The lost asset became history, but the lesson it carried endured. The KGB understood that intelligence superiority was no longer defined by control alone. It was defined by understanding systems well, enough to render them irrelevant without confrontation. In that contest, certainty was a liability. The Soviet Union never recovered what it lost, but it gained something else, clarity. The clarity that future conflicts would not always announce themselves. They would arrive quietly, disguised as routine, and leave behind questions rather than evidence. In the end, the KGB did not accuse the United States publicly. It did not need to. The loss itself was confirmation enough. The Soviet Union had lost a critical asset, and the most dangerous part was not who was responsible. It was how easily it had happened.